The wind howled across the jagged cliffs, slicing through the air like a blade. A lone figure lay still against the rocky surface, his body covered in a patchwork of dirt and broken leaves. His breathing was slow, barely perceptible, like a predator waiting to strike. Through the narrow slit in his helmet's visor, Daniel Pierce watched a group of towering figures lumber through the ravine below. They moved like they owned the place, arrogant, careless. They were mercenaries, and Daniel knew their type well. Big guns, bigger egos, and a tendency to underestimate anyone smaller than them. Daniel let out a quiet breath. Amateurs. They weren't soldiers. Not really. Soldiers respected the battlefield. These guys were just here to collect a paycheck, a big one, if they were willing to come all the way out here to hunt him down. The mercenaries' leader, a hulking reptilian alien named Krex, barked orders in his native tongue, a guttural series of growls that made the ground seem to shake. Krex was nearly 8 feet tall, his armor scratched and dented from years of combat. His scars were badges of honor, and his sharp-toothed grin showed just how confident he was. "Fan out!" Krex snarled in broken English. "The human is weak. Hunt him down!" Daniel's lips barely moved as he whispered to himself. "Yeah, keep thinking that." One of the mercenaries wandered too far from the group, stepping closer to the edge of the cliffs. Daniel had been waiting for this. He shifted his rifle slowly, barely a centimeter at a time. The reticle hovered over the mercenary's head. One breath in. One breath out. The trigger squeezed. The bullet tore through the air, silent and swift. The mercenary's skull snapped back, and his body crumpled over the cliff's edge, vanishing into the rocky abyss below. The mercenaries panicked. They shouted and stumbled over one another, firing blindly into the cliffs. Daniel stayed motionless, counting his shots, tracking their positions. He had the high ground, and in this game, that was everything. Krex snarled, slamming his fist into a boulder in frustration. "Cowards! Stop running!" His voice carried through the canyon like a thunderclap. "It's just one human!" Just one human. Daniel smirked. He loved that part. They always underestimated him. They thought because they were bigger, stronger, and covered in armor, they were untouchable. But they didn't know Daniel Pierce. They didn't know the soldier who spent 2 years surviving behind enemy lines in an alien warzone. They didn't know the sniper who once eliminated a warlord with a single shot from 2 miles away. They didn't know the man who had been left for dead so many times that death itself had gotten bored of waiting. The mercenaries reorganized, their panic giving way to cold determination. They spread out and started sweeping the area. Daniel felt a flicker of respect. Maybe they weren't as incompetent as he thought. Still, they were predictable. He watched one alien, a stocky brute with metal-plated arms, stumble toward a narrow passage Daniel had rigged earlier. The moment the alien stepped into the choke point, Daniel activated a remote detonator. The blast sent shrapnel flying, and the alien's body hit the ground with a sickening thud. Krex's voice boomed across the canyon again, furious and desperate. "You think you can kill us all, human?" Daniel whispered under his breath. "I don't think. I know." Hours passed as the mercenaries grew more cautious. They learned to check their corners, to move slower, to watch for traps. Daniel shifted positions constantly, like a ghost weaving through the rocks. Each time they thought they had him cornered, he was already gone, just a whisper in the wind. He took down 3 more mercenaries in quick succession, each shot clean and precise. He could see the fear growing in their eyes. The once arrogant swagger was gone. Now they looked over their shoulders, jumping at shadows. But Krex wouldn't break. The mercenary leader kept pushing forward, his rage boiling beneath the surface. Daniel knew this type, the kind too stubborn to know when they'd already lost. Krex's pride wouldn't let him back down, even when survival demanded it. As dusk fell, Daniel found a new vantage point high up on a narrow ledge. He had a clear shot at Krex. The leader stood in the open, barking orders at the last 2 mercenaries remaining. It would be an easy shot. One squeeze of the trigger, and this whole mess would be over. But Daniel hesitated. Something felt wrong. He adjusted his scope, scanning the area. That's when he saw it, a towering figure stomping through the trees below. It moved like a tank, its metal plating glinting in the fading light. The Enforcer. Daniel felt his pulse spike. The Enforcer wasn't just a machine, it was a war machine. Outfitted with heat sensors, adaptive armor, and enough firepower to level a small city, it was designed to flush out entrenched snipers like him. And worse, it didn't make mistakes. It didn't panic. It didn't hesitate. It just hunted. Daniel muttered under his breath. Okay, this just got interesting. The Enforcer's sensors swept the cliffs. Daniel knew it wouldn't take long for it to spot him. He had one shot, maybe two, before it locked on. He shifted his aim back to Krex. If he took out the leader now, maybe the remaining mercenaries would panic and scatter. But the Enforcer complicated things. He had to be smart. Fast. Precise. The robot's sensors paused, locking onto a small heat signature near a rock pile, one of Daniel's decoy traps. The machine unleashed a torrent of plasma fire, turning the rocks to molten slag. The decoy tricked it, but not for long. Daniel lined up his shot. Krex's head filled his scope. One breath in. One breath out. His finger tightened on the trigger, then stopped. Krex had moved, shifting just enough that the shot would miss. Daniel cursed under his breath and scanned for a better angle. That's when he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. He turned just in time to see one of the surviving mercenaries, a wiry alien with cybernetic limbs, lunging at him with a jagged knife. Daniel twisted away, narrowly avoiding the blade. The two men grappled on the narrow ledge, tumbling dangerously close to the cliff's edge. The mercenary's knife slashed at Daniel's arm, drawing blood. Daniel gritted his teeth and drove his elbow into the alien's ribs. The mercenary stumbled back, just far enough for Daniel to grab his sidearm. One shot rang out, and the alien's body toppled over the edge. Daniel staggered back to his sniper rifle, his breathing heavy. The Enforcer's sensors locked onto his position. Daniel grabbed his gear and bolted just as plasma fire scorched the rocks where he'd been lying. Stones crumbled and tumbled into the abyss below. He sprinted through the narrow trails, heart pounding in his chest. The Enforcer's mechanical steps thundered closer. Krex's voice echoed behind him, laughing wildly. "Run, human!" Krex roared. "Run as fast as you can. It won't matter. We'll find you, and when we do, you'll beg for a quick death." Daniel kept running, ignoring the burning pain in his arm. He was bleeding, exhausted, and outnumbered. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't done yet. Daniel crouched behind a jagged outcrop of rock, cradling his rifle close to his chest. His breathing was shallow, his arms still throbbing from the gash left by the mercenary's blade. Blood seeped through his sleeve, but he couldn't afford to stop now. The Enforcer's heavy footsteps echoed off the canyon walls, a metallic thunder rolling closer with each passing second. Daniel knew it wouldn't stop until it found him. He wiped the sweat from his brow, forcing himself to think. The Enforcer's sensors would be scanning for heat, movement, and sound. Staying still wouldn't save him for long. He had to act. His eyes flicked across the terrain. Scattered boulders, narrow trails, and loose gravel formed a chaotic battlefield. That could work. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small device, a noise emitter he'd rigged together using salvage tech. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it down the trail. It landed near a cluster of stones, activating with a faint, rhythmic beep. Moments later, the Enforcer's head swiveled toward the sound, its glowing red visor cutting through the evening gloom. The machine raised its arm, unleashing a volley of plasma fire that turned the rocks into molten slag. Daniel slipped away in the confusion, moving low and fast along the ridgeline. He counted each step, memorizing the terrain. He knew this place better than the mercenaries. They had been stomping through blindly, relying on brute force. Daniel had spent days mapping out the area, setting traps, and calculating firing angles. The cliffs weren't just an obstacle, they were his weapon. The remaining two mercenaries were still out there somewhere, and Daniel knew Krex wouldn't wait forever. The leader was smart enough to let the enforcer do the heavy lifting, but eventually, Krex would grow impatient. Daniel needed to shift the battlefield in his favor before that happened. He reached a vantage point overlooking a narrow canyon path, a perfect choke point. He unwrapped a small explosive charge, rigged it to a pressure trigger, and wedged it beneath a loose pile of rocks. With the trap set, Daniel moved higher, positioning himself with a clear line of sight. Moments later, one of the remaining mercenaries appeared, a bulky alien with crimson scales and a shoulder-mounted blaster. The mercenary moved cautiously, scanning the cliffs with narrowed eyes. Daniel knew his type: paranoid, jumpy, but dangerous in close quarters. He waited, finger poised on the trigger. The mercenary stepped closer, just inches from the explosive. Daniel exhaled, steadying himself. One clean shot would be enough. Then the mercenary stopped, raising his weapon and aiming directly at Daniel's position. Daniel froze. The mercenary hadn't seen him, not yet, but something had spooked him. A shift in the wind, a faint reflection, or maybe just instinct. Daniel knew this game: the longer they stared each other down, the more likely the mercenary would spot him. Daniel's mind raced. One shot could trigger the explosion, but only if the mercenary moved closer. If Daniel fired too early, he'd lose the advantage. The mercenary took one more step. Daniel squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the rocks beside the mercenary's foot, triggering the charge. The explosion erupted in a flash of fire and shrapnel, hurling the alien's body down the trail. Dust and smoke filled the air. Daniel didn't wait to see if the mercenary had survived. He was already moving. He climbed higher, weaving through the rocks as the enforcer's footsteps grew louder again. The machine was relentless, closing in with mechanical precision. Daniel reached another vantage point and paused to assess the situation. Krex and the final mercenary had regrouped, moving together now. The enforcer followed a few meters behind them, advancing like an unstoppable juggernaut. Daniel studied the path ahead. The terrain was steep and treacherous, riddled with narrow ledges and unstable rocks. He could use that. He shifted position and waited. Minutes crawled by as Krex and his remaining soldier moved closer. The mercenary lagged slightly behind, distracted, scanning the cliffs. Daniel knew he wouldn't get a better shot. He adjusted his aim, lining up his sights. One shot, one kill. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, and the mercenary dropped. Krex whirled, firing wildly into the cliffs. Daniel kept low, crawling to a new position. He knew Krex's anger would cloud his judgment. That was the key. Krex's voice echoed through the canyon, furious and raw. "You're just delaying the inevitable, human! Come down and face me!" Daniel ignored him. He wasn't about to trade insults with a man who barely knew how to lead. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out his last two explosive charges. He knew the enforcer was the real threat now. Krex was just noise, the enforcer was the storm. He waited until the towering machine lumbered into the choke point. Then he detonated the first charge. The blast sent debris crashing down from the cliff above, slamming into the enforcer's heavy frame. The machine staggered but didn't fall. Daniel triggered the second charge, this time directly beneath its feet. The explosion rocked the earth, and for a moment, the enforcer vanished in a cloud of dust and fire. Daniel didn't move, his rifle steady. As the smoke cleared, the enforcer remained standing, dented but still functional. Its glowing red visor flickered, then reignited. Its arm cannon swiveled toward Daniel's position. He ran. Plasma fire scorched the rocks behind him, sparks showering over the path as Daniel sprinted through the maze of cliffs. The enforcer followed relentlessly, stepping over rubble and debris like a mechanical predator. Daniel's lungs burned, his vision blurred, and his injured arm throbbed with every movement. He knew he couldn't outrun it forever. But then he saw it, a narrow stone bridge crossing a deep gorge. If he could lure the enforcer there, maybe, just maybe, he could end this. Daniel sprinted toward the bridge, firing a few wild shots to draw the machine's attention. The enforcer followed, its heavy steps shaking the ground. Daniel reached the far side and spun, leveling his rifle. He fired. The bullet struck a weakened section of rock at the bridge's base. Cracks splintered through the stone. The enforcer stepped forward, and with a deafening crack, the bridge gave way beneath it. The machine tumbled into the gorge below, vanishing into the shadows. Daniel leaned back against the rocks, chest heaving. The enforcer was gone, but he knew Cracks wouldn't give up so easily. The mercenary leader was still out there, and Daniel had no doubt he was coming. He wiped the blood from his arm and forced himself back to his feet. He wasn't finished yet. The night air was cold, and Daniel's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he moved along the rocky ledge. His muscles ached, his arm throbbed beneath the blood-soaked bandage, and his mind buzzed with exhaustion. He knew Cracks was still out there, and the mercenary leader wouldn't be far behind. The destruction of the enforcer had given Daniel a brief advantage, but Cracks was too stubborn to quit. Daniel doubted the mercenary had come this far just for money. No, this was personal now. He found a narrow crevice in the rock wall and wedged himself inside. It was barely wide enough to fit his frame, but that was what he needed, a tight space where he could listen, plan, and recover. He forced himself to stay awake, gripping his rifle like a lifeline. His mind drifted back to the mission that had put him in this mess. Months earlier, Daniel had been contracted by an intelligence agency to eliminate a notorious alien warlord named Velker. Velker had ruled over several outpost colonies, terrorizing both humans and alien factions alike. Daniel's mission had been simple: one shot, one kill. But what the agency hadn't told him was that Velker had a son. That son had put a price on Daniel's head so large that mercenaries from every corner of the galaxy had lined up to collect. Cracks wasn't here just for the bounty. He was here for vengeance. A rustling sound snapped Daniel back to the present. He tightened his grip on his rifle, his tired eyes narrowing. Footsteps crunched softly on the gravel below. A shadow shifted near the base of the cliff. Cracks, alone now, moving carefully through the darkness. The mercenary's massive frame loomed in the dim moonlight, his plasma rifle held ready. Daniel knew Cracks was no fool. He wouldn't charge him blindly like his men had. Cracks paused, scanning the area with sharp, predatory eyes. His armor was scratched and scorched from the earlier fight, but he moved with the steady confidence of a man who believed himself invincible. Daniel steadied his breathing. Cracks was in range, but Daniel knew better than to take the shot. Not yet. Cracks was too smart to expose himself unless he had a plan. Then Daniel noticed something, a faint red light flickering from Cracks's belt. A signal device. Daniel's stomach sank. Reinforcements. Cracks had called for backup. Daniel cursed under his breath. The destruction of the enforcer had left him drained. He didn't have enough ammo or explosives to deal with another squad of mercenaries. If Cracks's reinforcements arrived before Daniel found a way out, this fight was over. He moved slowly from his hiding place, crawling along the narrow ledge until he reached a better position. Cracks was still pacing below, muttering to himself in his native language. Daniel caught fragments of words: anger, frustration, revenge. Cracks wasn't just chasing a paycheck, he wanted blood. Suddenly, a figure appeared from the shadows behind Cracks, one of Cracks's own men, a wiry alien named Ravik who Daniel had thought was dead. Ravik's armor was damaged, and his face was bloodied, but he moved with purpose. Daniel watched as Ravik crept closer, a blade gleaming in his hand. For a moment, Daniel thought Ravik was going to kill Cracks, but then he realized what was happening. Ravik wasn't here for revenge. He was betraying Cracks for survival. Ravik's whispered words carried on the wind. "You're going to get us both killed," Ravik hissed. "This isn't about money anymore. The others are dead. The enforcer's gone. We should leave before." "You're a coward," Cracks growled, shoving Ravik back. "This human has humiliated us. I'm not leaving without his head." Ravik shook his head. "You're obsessed. This isn't just a mission to you, you've lost control." Cracks's face twisted into a snarl, and before Ravik could react, Cracks drew his knife and drove it into Ravik's side. The smaller alien staggered, choking on his own breath, as Krex wrenched the blade free. Ravik collapsed to the ground, twitching weakly before going still. Daniel felt a sick twist in his gut. Ravik had tried to back out, to do the smart thing, and Krex had killed him for it. The mercenary leader wasn't just dangerous, he was unraveling. Krex stood over Ravik's body for a moment, muttering something Daniel couldn't hear. Then he turned and stalked away down the trail, disappearing into the shadows. Daniel exhaled, easing back into the rocks. Krex had lost his mind, and that made him even more dangerous. Hours passed before Daniel dared to move again. When he finally slipped down to the path where Ravik's body lay, he found something unexpected, a data pad clutched in the dead man's hand. Daniel pried it loose and activated the screen. Ravik had recorded a message, a final attempt to reason with Krex. "He's not just some soldier," Ravik's voice rasped from the device. "This human, Daniel Pierce, he's ex-Black Ops. I checked the records. They called him the Ghost. He survived 2 years in enemy territory alone. He's not running from us, he's luring us in. Krex, if you hear this, turn back. This isn't a fight we can win." Daniel closed the data pad and stared at Ravik's body. The mercenary had tried to warn his leader. Now it was too late. Krex wouldn't stop, and Daniel knew there was only one way this was going to end. By the time dawn broke, Daniel had set his final trap. He used his last explosive charge to rig the cliff's edge above a narrow canyon pass, the only path Krex would likely take. Then Daniel positioned himself higher up, rifle steady, waiting for Krex to make his move. When Krex finally appeared, Daniel could tell the mercenary was barely holding it together. His armor was dented, his face twisted with rage, and his eyes bloodshot. Krex wasn't thinking anymore. He was driven by hate. Daniel waited until Krex reached the choke point. He aimed carefully, firing a single shot that struck the rocks just above the mercenary's head. Krex ducked, snarling as he returned fire. The plasma bolts scorched the cliffside, but Daniel held his ground. Another shot rang out, this time striking the explosive trigger. The blast rocked the canyon. Stones crumbled and fell, shattering against the path below. Krex staggered as the earth gave way beneath him. For a moment, Daniel thought it was over, but Krex caught a jagged outcrop and dragged himself back up. Blood streamed down his face as he locked eyes with Daniel. "You think this is over?" Krex rasped. "You think I can't kill you with my bare hands?" Daniel lowered his rifle. He was out of ammo anyway. Krex charged up the slope, teeth bared in a savage grin. Daniel let him come. At the last moment, Daniel sidestepped, driving his elbow into Krex's ribs. The mercenary stumbled but kept coming, swinging wildly. Daniel ducked the first blow, then slammed his fist into Krex's injured side. Krex staggered again, but his sheer size made him hard to stop. The two men grappled near the cliff's edge, trading blows until Krex finally grabbed Daniel by the throat, lifting him off the ground. Daniel gasped, struggling against Krex's iron grip. Spots danced in his vision. In a final desperate move, Daniel reached for the knife strapped to his belt and drove it into Krex's arm. The mercenary roared in pain, his grip loosening just enough for Daniel to break free. He shoved Krex back with all his strength. The mercenary stumbled, and this time, there was no ledge to save him. Krex's scream faded as he plummeted into the canyon below. Daniel stood at the edge, breathing hard, staring down into the shadows. It was over. The wind was still, and the jagged cliffs seemed frozen in the aftermath of the battle. Daniel stood at the edge, staring down into the shadowed canyon where Krex had fallen. His breathing slowed, the tension in his muscles beginning to fade, but his mind refused to relax. He had been in too many fights to believe it was truly over. Krex was gone, but Daniel knew mercenaries like him didn't work alone. The signal Krex had sent earlier still lingered in his mind like a ticking clock. Reinforcements were coming. It was only a matter of when. Daniel staggered away from the edge, clutching his injured arm. Blood had soaked through the bandages, and his body felt like a bundle of frayed nerves barely held together. Every muscle ached, and the deep gash along his side throbbed with relentless pain. He reached into his pack, pulling out a half-crushed medkit. The painkillers inside were his last dose, and he dry swallowed them without hesitation. The bitter taste lingered on his tongue, but he barely noticed. He needed to keep moving. The path back down the ridge was steep and treacherous. Daniel kept one hand on the rock wall as he descended, fighting the dizziness that threatened to pull him down. His boots slid on loose gravel more than once, and he nearly lost his footing. His mind replayed the battle in fragments, Krex's rage-filled eyes, the cold thud of Ravik's body hitting the ground, the explosion that had brought down the enforcer. The memories clashed in his head like sparks from a fire, refusing to settle. He forced himself to focus. Surviving the fight had been hard enough, surviving what came next would be even harder. As he reached the canyon floor, Daniel paused to examine the wreckage. The twisted remains of the enforcer lay sprawled across the rocks, smoke still curling from its scorched plating. The machine's visor flickered weakly, the glow sputtering like a dying flame. Daniel kept his distance, knowing better than to assume the war machine was completely neutralized. He watched for several moments until the flickering light finally went dark. A faint rustling sound reached his ears, and Daniel froze. He slipped behind a boulder, raising his rifle, now reduced to little more than a club with no ammunition. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with a limp. Daniel's heart jumped before he recognized the face. It was Ravik. Daniel had seen Ravik collapse earlier, stabbed and bleeding out beneath Krex's blade. Yet somehow, the wiry alien had survived. Ravik's face was pale, and he clutched his wounded side with one hand. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes were sharp as they scanned the canyon. Daniel considered staying hidden, but Ravik seemed less like a threat and more like a man teetering on the edge of collapse. Daniel stepped out slowly, his rifle lowered. Ravik flinched, gripping his knife weakly, but Daniel held up a hand. "I'm not here to finish you," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "If you wanted me dead, you'd have called out already." Ravik stared at him for a long moment before lowering his blade. "You should have killed Krex sooner," Ravik muttered bitterly. "Might have saved me some trouble." Daniel gave a tired smile. "I was working on it." Ravik's hand trembled as he leaned against a boulder for support. Blood still oozed from his side, soaking his armor. He shook his head, muttering something in his own language before fixing his gaze on Daniel. "They're coming," Ravik said. "Krex's signal. I heard the transmission before he turned on me. More mercenaries, maybe 6 or 7. They'll be here by morning." Daniel swore under his breath. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his chest tighten. He looked up at the cliffs. The battlefield was littered with debris, collapsed rock, and fallen mercenaries. There were no clean exits, no obvious place to mount a defense. His ammo was nearly gone, and he didn't have the strength for another prolonged fight. "You can't stay here," Ravik added. "If they catch you, they won't just kill you, they'll make you wish they had." Daniel glanced at Ravik, noting the pain in his voice. Whatever loyalty Ravik once had to Krex and his crew was long gone. Desperation had a way of revealing what people were really made of. "You know a way out?" Daniel asked. Ravik nodded weakly. "North Ridge. There's a narrow pass, leads to the old supply trails. If we move fast, we can be long gone before they get here." "We?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You think I'm sticking around for them to kill me too?" Ravik muttered. "I helped Krex because I didn't have a choice. But I'm not dying for his vendetta." Daniel considered the offer. Trusting Ravik was a risk, but the alternative was staying in the canyon to face another squad of mercenaries alone, and that was a death sentence. He gave a short nod. "All right," Daniel said. "Lead the way." The journey to the North Ridge was slow and brutal. Ravik struggled to stay upright, and Daniel's body screamed with every step. The rocky trail wound through narrow passages, forcing them to climb over jagged boulders and squeeze through tight gaps in the stone. Twice, Ravik stumbled, and Daniel had to haul him back to his feet. The painkillers were wearing off, and Daniel's vision swam with fatigue. They reached the top of the ridge just before dawn. The sky was a dull shade of purple, the first hints of morning creeping over the horizon. Below them, Daniel could see movement, 6 figures moving steadily through the canyon. Crex's reinforcements had arrived, heavily armed and scanning the cliffs with predatory focus. Daniel felt his breath tighten. If they had been just an hour slower, they would have walked right into them. "We're not safe yet," Ravik rasped. "The supply trail's about half a mile north. We stay low, we stay quiet, and we might just live." They moved with careful precision, sticking close to the rocks. The mercenaries below showed no signs of spotting them, and for the first time in hours, Daniel began to believe they might actually make it out. But just as they reached the trailhead, Ravik stumbled again, falling hard against a loose patch of gravel. The stones tumbled down the slope in a loud, clattering cascade. One of the mercenaries turned sharply, his gaze snapping toward the ridge. He barked something to his team, and Daniel watched in grim silence as the squad adjusted course, heading directly for them. "Go," Ravik wheezed. "You can still make it." "Not without you," Daniel growled, dragging Ravik to his feet. The mercenaries were closing in fast. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as they stumbled forward. The supply trail came into view, a narrow path winding down into the trees below. The moment they reached the trail's edge, Daniel stopped, gripping Ravik by the collar. "Down!" Daniel ordered. Ravik barely had time to react before Daniel shoved him over the ledge. The fall was only a few feet, but the slope was steep and hidden by brush. Ravik tumbled out of sight, vanishing into the undergrowth. Daniel followed a second later, biting back a grunt of pain as his wounded arms slammed against the rocky ground. The mercenaries reached the ridge moments later, scanning the area in confusion. Daniel held his breath as the footsteps passed above them, boots crunching along the path. For several minutes either man moved. Finally, the footsteps faded into the distance. The forest swallowed them in a blanket of shadow and silence. The towering trees loomed above, their twisted branches blocking out most of the morning light. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the undergrowth was thick enough to slow their progress. Daniel moved carefully, each step deliberate, his rifle clutched tightly in his injured hands. Ravik stumbled behind him, clutching his wounded side and breathing heavily. Neither spoke much, their focus locked on the narrow game trail that wound deeper into the wilderness. Daniel knew their position wasn't secure yet. The mercenaries would spread out once they realized their prey had escaped. If Crex's reinforcements were anything like him, they wouldn't stop until they found blood on the ground. Daniel had seen men like them before, mercenaries who believed reputation mattered more than reason. Failure wasn't an option for those types. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about pride. The path twisted downhill, and Daniel paused to scan the area. The thick trees thinned out below, revealing a clearing choked with jagged rocks and twisted roots. He didn't like the look of it. Open ground was a sniper's nightmare. Too many angles, too few places to hide. His instincts told him to backtrack, but Ravik's labored breathing warned him they didn't have time for detours. "We'll cut through here," Daniel muttered over his shoulder. "You sure?" Ravik croaked. "Feels like a trap." Daniel's tired eyes swept the clearing again. It did feel like a trap. But no footprints marked the soft dirt, and no movement stirred in the shadows. "We move fast," Daniel said. "If they're close, they won't be expecting us to go this way." Ravik grunted in response, and they pressed forward. The clearing was even more exposed than it looked from the ridge. Each step felt too loud, each gust of wind seemed too sharp. Daniel's eyes never stopped moving. He tracked every tree, every rock, every patch of shadow that could conceal a gun barrel or a watchful eye. Halfway through the clearing, Ravik stumbled again, and Daniel caught his arm before he fell. "You're not gonna last much longer like this," Daniel muttered. "I've lasted longer with worse," Ravik grunted back. Daniel wasn't sure if Ravik was being stubborn or just too exhausted to admit the truth. His face was pale now, his breathing ragged. Blood still seeped through his bandages. If they didn't find help soon, Ravik wasn't going to make it. The sound of snapping branches froze them both in place. Daniel spun, rifle raised. Through the trees at the far end of the clearing, two figures emerged, mercenaries, heavily armed and scanning the area like wolves scenting blood. Daniel's heart raced. They had been tracked faster than he expected. "Down!" Daniel whispered. He dragged Ravik behind a cluster of rocks and dropped low. The mercenaries moved closer, their voices low as they spoke in a guttural alien dialect. Daniel's hands tightened around his rifle. He knew his chances of taking out both before one of them got a shot off were slim, even slimmer in his condition. The mercenaries stopped barely 20 yards away, surveying the area with sharp eyes. One of them pointed to the faint trail of blood left by Ravik's wound. The taller of the two, a brutish figure with metallic implants lining his face, grunted and motioned toward the path Daniel and Ravik had taken. "They know," Ravik murmured weakly. Daniel didn't answer. He knew they had seconds before the mercenaries followed the blood trail straight to their position. He spotted a loose stone near his feet, heavy enough to throw, not heavy enough to kill. But it might be enough to cause a distraction. He gripped the stone and hurled it to the right. It clattered loudly against the roots of a dead tree. The mercenaries turned sharply, rifles raised. One of them barked something, moving cautiously toward the sound. Daniel knew this was his only chance. He rose just enough to line up his shot and squeeze the trigger. The crack of the rifle cut through the air, and the nearest mercenary staggered back, blood spraying from his chest. The second mercenary spun and fired wildly in Daniel's direction, plasma bolts scorching the rock face inches from his head. Daniel ducked low, dragging Ravik with him as they crawled toward the tree line. Behind them, the remaining mercenary charged after them, shouting in rage. Daniel reached the trees first, diving behind a fallen log. The mercenary appeared a second later, weapon raised, but Daniel struck first. He slammed the butt of his rifle into the man's knee, sending him sprawling. The mercenary hit the ground hard, cursing as he fumbled for his weapon. Daniel moved fast, ignoring the pain in his arm. He drove his boot into the mercenary's wrist, kicking the plasma rifle away. The mercenary lashed out, grabbing Daniel's injured arm. Pain exploded through his body, and he gritted his teeth, struggling to wrestle free. The mercenary drew a knife with his free hand and slashed at Daniel's throat. Daniel barely twisted away in time, feeling the blade scrape along his shoulder. With a surge of adrenaline, Daniel grabbed the mercenary's wrist and twisted sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, and Daniel delivered a sharp punch to the man's temple. The mercenary went limp. Daniel staggered back, clutching his bleeding arm. His vision blurred, but he forced himself to stay upright. Ravik lay slumped against a tree, his breathing shallow. "You still alive?" Daniel muttered. "Barely," Ravik rasped. "We need to keep moving," Daniel said. "If they don't check in soon, the others will come looking." Ravik coughed, his face tight with pain. I can't run anymore." Daniel's mind raced. There was no way he could carry Ravik for long, not in his condition. He glanced down at the fallen mercenaries. One of their radios was still intact. It was risky, but it might be their only way out. "I've got an idea," Daniel said. "But you're not gonna like it." He grabbed the radio and switched it on, adjusting the frequency to match the mercenary's signal. Static hissed for a moment, then a harsh voice crackled through. "Report. Status update. Where are you?" Daniel pressed the transmitter, mimicking the growling accent of Krex's men. "Target lost," Daniel said. "We're sweeping the northern ridge now." There was a pause, and Daniel held his breath. "Copy that," the voice replied. "Regroup in 2 hours at the west coordinates." Daniel switched off the radio and let out a slow breath. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to buy them time. "We'll head west," Daniel said. "Keep low, stay quiet. If they think we're somewhere else, we might slip past them." Ravik gave a weak nod. Daniel helped him to his feet, and together they limped deeper into the forest. The pain in Daniel's body grew worse with every step, but he kept pushing forward. Survival wasn't just about skill, it was about stubbornness. About refusing to quit even when everything screamed at you to stop. Hours later, the trees finally thinned, revealing the jagged silhouette of distant mountains. Beyond those peaks lay a small trading outpost, a place where they could regroup, recover, and disappear before the mercenaries realized they'd been deceived. "We're close," Daniel muttered.